In the quaint village of Marrowwood, where the mist rolled over the hills like a slow-moving sea each evening, there was a single, crooked road that led to the old Harrow estate. The estate had been deserted for decades, its history marred by tragedy and whispered rumors of curses. It was the perfect place for Lena, a budding horror novelist, to spend a month in solitude, seeking inspiration for her next book. Lena arrived at the estate just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her car as she drove up the winding driveway. The house itself was a sprawling Gothic manor, its once majestic features now succumbing to decay. Ivy crept up the walls, and the windows, dark and foreboding, reflected the last vestiges of twilight. As she stepped inside, a cold draft swept through the grand hallway. The air was thick with the scent of mold and abandonment. "Perfect," Lena whispered to herself, a small smile playing on her lips as she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She spent the first few hours exploring the rooms, her flashlight casting eerie shadows against the peeling wallpaper and dusty chandeliers. The house was larger than she had anticipated, with countless rooms and several hidden passages that whispered secrets of a bygone era. In the library, books lay scattered across the floor, their pages yellowed and torn. It was here, amid the forgotten stories and faded leather bindings, that Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. That night, as Lena settled into the master bedroom, the wind began to howl, a mournful cry that seemed almost human. Sleep eluded her as the sounds of the house settling became more pronounced, each creak and groan a voice from the past calling out to be remembered. At midnight, she heard the first unmistakable sound that did not belong to the wind, a soft thumping coming from the attic above. Curiosity piqued, Lena wrapped herself in a shawl and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The door was slightly ajar, moving back and forth as if pushed by an unseen hand. Heart pounding, she pushed it open, the old wood squealing in protest. The attic was cluttered with old furniture covered in white sheets, which in the dim light of her flashlight looked disturbingly like shrouded figures. As she stepped further inside, the floorboards creaked under her weight. Suddenly, the small window at the far end slammed shut, and the room was thrust into an oppressive silence. Lena spun around, her breath caught in her throat, expecting to see someone or something behind her. But there was nothing. Shaken but determined not to let fear overcome her, Lena began to rummage through the boxes and trunks scattered about. She uncovered old photographs, trinkets, and journals, each item a piece of the puzzle that was the history of Harrow Estate. One journal, bound in faded red velvet, caught her attention. It belonged to Elizabeth Harrow, the last mistress of the estate, who had reportedly vanished without a trace. Lena settled down to read the journal by the light of her flashlight. Elizabeth's entries were erratic, filled with tales of sorrow and increasing paranoia. She wrote of voices that whispered to her at night, of shadows that moved of their own accord, and of her growing fear that something in the house meant to do her harm. The more Lena read, the colder the room became, until her breath formed clouds in the air. A sudden movement caught her eye, a shadow passing quickly by the attic window. She rushed to look, but there was nothing there, only the wild branches of the old oak tree swaying in the wind. Returning to the journal, Lena turned the page and froze. There, in Elizabeth's shaky handwriting, was a warning: beware the eyes that see in the dark, for they see your soul and mark it for their own. A low thud sounded behind her, like something heavy being dropped. Lena whirled around, flashlight darting across the room, heart racing. As the beam settled on a corner of the attic, it illuminated a dusty mirror leaning against the wall, its surface streaked with age. Lena approached, peering into the glass, and gasped. Reflected back at her was not just her own pale, frightened face, but the faint, translucent image of a woman standing right behind her. Whipping around, Lena found the room empty. She turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Trembling, she glanced down at the journal, only to see that the pages were now blank, as if their words had been erased, or had never been written at all. As the wind continued to wail outside, Lena realized she was not alone in the house. The secrets of Harrow Estate were alive, woven into the very walls that surrounded her, and they were calling to her, pulling her deeper into their mystery. Despite the overwhelming fear and the icy fingers of dread that crept up her spine, Lena's curiosity was piqued. She needed answers, and she knew the only way to find them was to delve deeper into the secrets of Harrow Estate. With trembling hands, she pocketed the now blank journal and left the attic, her mind racing with the images of the woman in the mirror. As she descended the stairs, the house seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening, stretching out like fingers trying to grasp her. The wind outside had picked up, its howls now accompanied by the occasional sharp clatter of tree branches against the windows. Every sound made Lena jump, her nerves frayed by the palpable tension that filled the air. Back in the safety of the master bedroom, Lena tried to calm her racing heart. She sat on the edge of the bed, the old springs groaning under her weight. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, despite the heavy blankets piled atop the bed. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but the chill seemed to seep into her bones, a constant reminder of the unnatural presence in the house. Unable to sleep, she spent the night poring over other documents she had found in the attic, a collection of letters, newspaper clippings, and even more photographs. Many were too worn or faded to read, but those she could make out spoke of tragedy and loss. The Harrow family had been plagued by misfortune, each generation meeting a grim fate, often within the walls of the estate itself. As dawn broke, the storm outside subsided, and for a moment, Lena felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the daylight would dispel the horrors of the night. But as she looked around the dimly lit room, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The photographs she had spread out on the floor were now arranged in a circle, their faces turned inward. She was certain she hadn't left them that way. Heart-pounding, Lena stood and approached the circle. As she neared, she could see that each photograph depicted a member of the Harrow family, their eyes seeming to stare up at her, filled with sorrow and warning. At the center of the circle was a photograph she hadn't noticed before. It was a picture of the house, taken from a distance, and in one of the upper windows, a figure could be seen looking out. The figure was blurry, indistinct, but unmistakably the same woman she had seen in the mirror. Shaken, Lena gathered the photographs, breaking the circle. She felt an immediate sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted. But the relief was short-lived. A sudden, sharp knock on the bedroom door made her jump. It was too deliberate to be the result of the wind. Someone, or something, was in the house with her. With a deep breath, Lena approached the door, her hand hesitating on the knob. She opened it slowly, peering into the dark hallway. There was nothing there. The corridor was empty, the other doors closed. But the air felt different now, heavier, as if charged with expectation. Lena stepped out into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Their house was silent now, the storm outside having moved on. The only sounds were her own breathing and the soft creaking of the floorboards under her feet. She made her way down the corridor, drawn by an inexplicable force towards the library. The library door was ajar, and as she pushed it open, she noticed that the room was much colder than the rest of the house. The air inside was thick with the smell of old books and burning candles. Candles! Lena hadn't lit any candles. Yet there they were, a dozen of them, flickering on the mantelpiece, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Among the shadows, Lena saw figures moving, just at the edge of her vision. She spun around, but there was nothing there, only books and shadows. Her heart raced as she realized the figures were not in the room with her but were somehow part of the shadows themselves. Drawn to the flickering candles, Lena approached the mantelpiece. Each candle was placed in front of a different book, as if marking it. On impulse, Lena reached for the book nearest to her. It was an old ledger, the leather cover cracked and worn. She opened it, and as she flipped through the pages, she realized it was not a book at all but a collection of rituals and incantations, each more disturbing than the last. The words on the page seemed to pulse with a dark energy, drawing Lena in. She read aloud without thinking, the words slipping from her lips as if compelled by some unseen force. As she spoke the final incantation, the candles flared brightly, illuminating the room with a harsh, unnatural light. And then, as suddenly as they had flared, the candles extinguished, plunging the room back into darkness. The sudden shift from light to dark left Lena blinking, her eyes struggling to adjust. The last echoes of her spoken words seemed to hang in the air, a whisper of power that had briefly come alive around her. With the room now in darkness, Lena felt the temperature drop even further, the chill seeping into her very bones. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, her breath visible in the cold air. It was then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the shadows. It was not her name that it spoke, but something else, a word she didn't understand, yet it filled her with an inexplicable dread. Heart-pounding, Lena reached out blindly for her flashlight. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, and she grabbed it, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the towering bookshelves and the sea of shadows between them. As the light swept across the room, it briefly illuminated a figure standing in the far corner, a tall, thin shape, almost blending into the surroundings. Lena gasped, taking a step back. The figure was motionless, its features obscured by the dark. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the figure stepped forward into the light. It was a man, or at least the semblance of one, dressed in the garb of an earlier century. His face was pale, his eyes dark hollows that seemed to absorb the light around them. "Who are you?" Lena's voice was barely a whisper, fear tightening her throat. The figure didn't speak, but as it moved closer, the air grew colder, and Lena could see her breath clouding in front of her. The figure stopped just at the edge of the light, its presence oppressive, almost suffocating. Lena felt an urge to flee, to run from the library and the house, but her legs refused to move, as if rooted to the spot. Instead of answering, the figure simply raised a hand and pointed to a book on one of the lower shelves. The gesture was deliberate, commanding. Lena followed the direction of his pointed finger, her flashlight illuminating the spine of an old, dusty book. It was unmarked, its cover worn and faded. Compelled by a force she didn't understand, Lena stepped forward and pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked, its pages edged with age. She opened it to the first page, and her flashlight flickered as if struggling against an unseen force. The words on the page were written in a flowing, elegant script, but they were in a language she didn't recognize, filled with strange symbols and diagrams. As she turned the pages, the whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to rise from the book itself. The room spun around her, the shadows twisting and turning into forms and faces that blinked in and out of existence. Lena's heart raced, her mind screamed for her to close the book, but she couldn't, her hands were no longer hers to control. Page after page turned, each revealing more of the dark secrets held within. The voices became a cacophony, their words intertwining until one phrase became clear, repeated over and over: "The binding is broken, the path is open." A sudden, sharp pain shot through Lena's head, like a spike driven through her skull. She cried out, dropping the book, which hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the room. The pain receded as quickly as it had come, leaving her dizzy and disoriented. She stumbled backward, her hand finding the wall for support. When she looked up, the figure was gone. The room was silent once more, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the soft thud of her heartbeat in her ears. Clutching her head, Lena slid down the wall to the floor, her mind racing. What had just happened? What had she unleashed? The book lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering as if in a breeze that shouldn't exist in the closed room. She knew she needed to leave, to escape the house and its horrors. But as she pushed herself to her feet, a new realization dawned on her. The house wouldn't let her leave, not now. Whatever she had awakened with the book was now aware of her, and it had plans of its own. Lena's only hope lay in understanding the words of the book, in deciphering the secrets it held. Only then might she find a way to undo what had been done and free herself from the house's grasp. As she picked up the book and dusted off its cover, the house seemed to settle around her, a silent observer waiting to see what she would do next. Lena took a deep breath and opened the book once more, determined to find answers. But as she read, the whispering resumed, a sinister undertone to each syllable that seemed to slither around her, coiling tighter with every word she deciphered. Lena's fingers trembled as they turned the pages, her eyes scanning the cryptic text that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The library's walls appeared to close in, the shadows deepening, becoming denser as if absorbing the dim light of her flashlight. The air grew thick, charged with a palpable sense of dread that hung heavily around her. Lena could feel it seeping into her bones, a cold that went beyond the physical, chilling her soul. As she delved deeper into the book, Lena began to piece together a narrative that was as horrifying as it was fascinating. The book spoke of a ritual, one that had been performed centuries ago in this very house, intended to open a gateway to another realm. Their purpose had been to gain knowledge and power, but instead, it had unleashed something dark, something that had been meant to remain hidden beyond the veils of reality. The ritual required several key components, a convergence of specific celestial events, a circle of power drawn in a precise location within the house, and a chant that needed to be recited at the stroke of midnight. But the most chilling aspect was the need for a living conduit, a soul through which the energies of the other realm could be channeled. Lena's heart raced as she realized that the figure she had seen, the ghostly presence in the library, might have been one of the original participants in the ritual, perhaps even the conduit itself, trapped between worlds, bound to the house for eternity. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, her mind recoiling at the implications. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging her on, guiding her through the book. Lena felt a growing compulsion to continue, driven by a force she could neither understand nor resist. Each page turned seemed to tighten the spectral chains that bound her to the house, to its dark history and its even darker inhabitants. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, a gust of wind swirling through the room despite the stillness of the air outside. Lena's flashlight flickered erratically, casting wild shadows across the walls, the dancing figures taking on grotesque, menacing forms. A low moan echoed through the room, a sound of such despair and agony that Lena clapped her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror. But the sound did not abate, instead, it grew in intensity, joined by other voices, a chorus of the damned that filled the library with their lament. Lena felt the air around her pulsate with energy, the pages of the book flipping rapidly in front of her as if blown by a storm. She tried to step back, to escape the cacophony and the chilling spectacle, but her legs were unresponsive, rooted to the spot as if the floor itself had grasped her. The book's chant echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat that synchronized with her racing heart. In desperation, Lena reached out, her fingers brushing against the book's cover, attempting to close it. But as she touched it, a shock of energy coursed through her, knocking her to the ground. The flashlight went out, plunging the room into complete darkness, the only light now emanating from the pages of the open book, glowing an eerie, unnatural green. Lena lay there, gasping for breath, her body paralyzed by the overwhelming power that filled the room. The voices crescendoed, reaching a peak, their words unintelligible yet clearly filled with urgent pleading and dire warnings. Above it all, the figure reappeared, its form clearer now, its eyes glowing with the same green light as the book. It moved towards her, its hand outstretched as if offering assistance or perhaps demanding something from her. Lena could only watch, her voice lost to the shadows, her fate seemingly sealed by the ancient words and the forgotten ritual that had claimed the Harrow estate and all who dared to uncover its secrets. As the figure reached Lena, its touch cold yet somehow comforting, the voices fell silent, the room calmed, and the light from the book dimmed. Lena felt the weight of centuries lift slightly, offering a brief respite, a moment of clarity in the midst of chaos. But as she looked into the figure's eyes, she knew that this was only the beginning. The ritual had been started anew, and she was now inextricably part of it, bound to the house and its spectral inhabitants, her story woven into the tapestry of its haunted legacy. The ghostly figure hovered over Lena, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. As it extended its hand, a series of rapid images flashed before her eyes, scenes of the ritual performed long ago, the convergence of celestial bodies, the circle of power, and the terrible consequences that followed. Lena saw the participants, their faces twisted in agony as they became trapped between worlds, their spirits condemned to haunt the Harrow estate. Lena realized with a sickening clarity that the figure before her was not just a lost soul but the ritual's master, bound to the estate not only by his actions but by his overwhelming desire to complete what had been started. His eyes, glowing with a ghostly light, seemed to pierce through her, seeing into the very depths of her soul. "You are the key," the figure's voice echoed in her mind, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The circle must be closed, the gateway sealed. Lena felt an invisible force lifting her to her feet, drawing her towards the book still open on the floor. The pages glowed brighter now, a beacon in the dark library. She knew what was expected of her, the knowledge had been implanted in her mind by the visions. Yet, every fiber of her being resisted, her instinct screaming for her to run, to escape the fate that had befallen the others. As she stood before the book, the air around her thickened, the shadows deepening until they seemed almost solid. The voices of the damned rose once again, a cacophony of despair that filled the room, pressuring her to act. With trembling hands, Lena began the chant, the ancient words feeling foreign yet familiar as they left her lips. The house responded immediately, a low rumble shaking the ground beneath her feet as if the very foundation reacted to the incantation. The wind howled through the broken windows, the candles flickered back to life, their flames dancing wildly. As she continued the chant, Lena felt the energy in the room converging on her. The ghostly figure's presence grew stronger, its form becoming more defined, more human. It was as if the ritual was not only closing the gateway but also restoring what had been lost, though at what cost, Lena could not be sure. The climax of the chant approached, and with each word, Lena felt her energy draining, her life force being pulled into the book. The shadows around her swirled faster, forming a vortex that threatened to consume her entirely. She knew she could not stop, the consequences would be catastrophic. With the last of her strength, she spoke the final word of the incantation. A blinding light erupted from the book, enveloping Lena in its brilliance. The ground shook, the walls trembled, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as quickly as it had started, the light receded, the rumbling stopped, and the house fell silent. Lena collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. The library was calm now, the atmosphere no longer oppressive but somehow purified. She looked around, half expecting the ghostly figure to reappear, but it was gone. The book lay closed on the floor, its cover no longer glowing, just an ordinary old tome once more. Slowly, Lena stood, her body aching, her mind reeling from what she had experienced. The Harrow estate felt different now, as if a great burden had been lifted. The air was clearer, the oppressive feeling of dread that had pervaded the place gone. She walked to the window, looking out at the dawn breaking over the horizon, the first light casting the world in a new, hopeful glow. Yet, as she watched the sunrise, Lena knew that while she had closed the gateway and ended the immediate threat, the house would never be just a house. It had seen too much, witnessed too much horror. And she, now a part of its history, would never be able to forget what had happened here. She turned away from the window, her resolve strengthened. Perhaps she could find a way to use her newfound knowledge to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. As she left the library, stepping into the new day, Lena felt a mix of trepidation and determination. The Harrow estate's legacy of horror was over, but its story, her story, was just beginning. As Lena walked through the silent halls of the Harrow estate, the early morning light cast long shadows that seemed to whisper of the house's dark past. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, a stark reminder of the isolation she had felt since arriving. The once oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but the house still held a quiet melancholy, as if mourning its own history of sorrow and darkness. Lena paused at the entrance, her hand resting on the door. She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the grand staircase and the faded portraits that lined the walls. The faces of the Harrow family seemed less sinister now, more tragic, caught in the web of their own making. It was over, she had ended their torment, but the cost was etched deep in her soul. Turning to leave, Lena stepped out into the fresh morning air. The estate, bathed in the golden light of dawn, looked almost peaceful, its true nature disguised by the beauty of the sunrise. But Lena knew better. She knew that beneath the surface lay secrets that would always be a part of the house, whispers in the walls that would never fully be silenced. As she walked down the gravel path, the weight of her experiences heavy on her shoulders, Lena felt a strange sense of responsibility. She had uncovered the truths hidden within the Harrow estate, had faced its ghosts and survived. Now, she carried those stories with her, a guardian of the dark tales that others were too fearful to face. Reaching her car, Lena paused, looking back at the house one last time. It stood majestic and solemn against the rising sun, a monument to both its grim history and its recent redemption. She knew she would write about what had happened, that she would share the story of Harrow Estate with the world. But she would be careful, for she understood now the power of such places, the way they could haunt not just their halls, but the minds of those who ventured too close. Starting the car, Lena drove away from the estate, the house receding in her rearview mirror. The road ahead was clear, the sky bright with the promise of a new day. But in her heart, Lena carried a shadow, a piece of the darkness that would never completely leave her. As she drove, the first words of her next novel formed in her mind, a tale of a haunted estate and the woman who dared to unlock its secrets. It would be a story of courage and fear, of the thin veil between this world and the next. Lena smiled slightly, a sense of purpose filling her. The Harrow estate was behind her, but its legacy would live on, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And somewhere, in the deep recesses of the house she had left behind, the faint echo of a whisper drifted through the empty rooms, a sigh of relief or perhaps a lament, a haunting note that lingered in the air like the last chord of a song, beautiful and terrifying in its finality.